Well, throughout the campaign, David Coletto, the CEO of Abacus Data, has joined us to look at the campaign by the numbers, the issues, the horse race, the regions, the voters, how the leaders are doing, and there he is. He's with me again today. David, good to see you again. And just to put this out there about the discussion of polls on Election Day, because I know a lot of viewers will wonder why we're talking about this. The election rules for discussing polls on Election Day: media cannot publish any new surveys on Election Day, but we're free to discuss what the polls are telling us until now and what they've been showing us. And we're going to cover the most recent numbers from Abacus Data to give us some context, just out yesterday, David, for this voting day. So let's start there. Tell me about the findings. What do we need to know about this survey and the methodology?
So good to see you, Peter. This survey was done from Friday until Sunday. You're right, we released it yesterday afternoon. Interviewed over 2,400 eligible voters across the country, and it was conducted online, and it's representative of the Canadian population.
All right, so let's look at the numbers. What's the latest when it comes to where we think the vote might be headed?
So, I don't think it gets much closer than this, although it hasn't really changed over the last few weeks. We've got the Conservatives at 32 nationally, the Liberals at 31, the NDP at 19, the Bloc at 7, the People's Party at 6, and the Greens at 4. You can see in that right-hand column the change from last weekend, a little down for the New Democrats, a little up for the People's Party, but for the most part, pretty stable numbers and an incredibly close race. So, today, as millions of Canadians head to the polls and vote, this is shaping up to be as close a race as it was in 2019. And I think there's going to be dozens and dozens of seats across the country that could be decided within a few hundred or at least 1,000 votes. So every vote's going to count today. Right.
What happens when you break those numbers down by region and by province? What are we seeing?
Yeah, well, what we see is what we've seen in the past. In British Columbia, it looks like a closer race between the Conservatives and the New Democrats. Both are vying to win the popular vote out west, with the Liberals in third. In the prairies, we continue to see the Conservatives doing very well in Alberta. Similarly in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, although in some parts of Manitoba and Saskatchewan, we see the New Democrats and in some cases the Liberals doing well. So Manitoba is certainly different than Saskatchewan, although we lump them together, which always drives folks from those two provinces a little nuts. But the story really is in Ontario, and while the Liberals may lose the popular vote again, they are still the favorites to win at least a minority, because they've got an 8-point lead in Ontario that's matched in many other polls that were released yesterday, 40 to 32. In Quebec, looks a lot like 2019, 31 Liberal, 30 Bloc. Very different voting patterns in Montreal and around Montreal and outside, which should give the Liberals, again, enough seats that gets them to that plurality in the House. And then out in Atlantic Canada, it's still, Liberals well ahead of the Conservatives and the New Democrats. So the big picture on the regional numbers is a close national race still obscures, I think, an advantage for the Liberals today, and we'll see, obviously, as people vote.
You also wanted to find out, let's talk about that, when people actually did vote and who waited until Election Day. What did you find there?
Well, a good number of people said they voted already. In our survey, 42% said they had already cast a ballot. Most of that happening at advanced polls. We know Elections Canada told us turnout at advanced polls was higher than it was in 2019. So that shows up in our numbers. About 9% in our sample said they voted by mail. It's a little high. I think it's usually, I think the actual number is probably going to be closer to 7 or 8%. But what's interesting is in our survey, among those who voted at advanced polls, we see the Conservatives with a 7-point lead over the Liberals. Among those who voted by mail, it's pretty much tied. And then the other is those who showed up at Elections Canada returning offices. Very small sample, but shows the Liberals ahead there. If that number is true, particularly on the advanced poll, then the Conservatives have a kind of baked-in advantage. They won the advanced poll in 2019 by a few points. I think it's probably a little bit closer. Again, sample size, sampling error means, give these numbers a little bit of a sort of a wiggle, but it shows that the Conservatives may have had an advantage going to that weekend before advanced polls. Those who say they're going to vote today, the Liberals have a slight lead, which is how you get more or less a tie nationally.
Okay, let's look at that all-important number that can suggest how motivated the voters are for something new, desire for change. What's been happening as the campaign ends?
So we find, we're at a point now where 50% of Canadians say they definitely want a change in government. That's that darker gray at the very bottom of that slide. 19% say they definitely want the incumbents reelected. And if you look at how it compares to the end of the 2019 campaign, not very different, right? This is why this campaign feels like deja vu. Coming into it, we're not really sure the outcome. We think the Liberals might win a minority, but they might lose the popular vote. But certainly over the campaign, that desire for change has increased. That typically happens, but it's not at a level where I think the Conservatives and the New Democrats need it to be in order to clearly defeat the Liberals. But what's interesting, and that's the slide that's on your screen now, when we ask people, who do you think is going to win? Almost half of Canadians, 43%, say they think the Liberals are going to win this election. That's up 6 points from last week. 23% think the Conservatives are going to win. That's down 3. And so as this campaign has come into the final days, the perception, the expectation of more people is that this Liberal government is likely going to get reelected. And so if you're the Liberals trying to get voters to vote strategically or tactically, that's harder to do when people don't think the prospect of a Conservative win is likely to happen. So which is why I think we're seeing, at least for now in our polls, the NDP number holding pretty steady into these final days of the campaign.
Yeah, that could be a really interesting factor in the results tonight. Let's turn to the impression of the leaders. Have we seen any significant changes at campaign's end?
No, not at all, really. Mr. Trudeau's got about equal numbers positive and negative, 39 positive, 44 negative. Mr. O'Toole, early in the campaign, had a real boost in his sort of image, but he's hit a plateau where we're about 31%. He hasn't been able to get above that. View him positively. And then Mr. Singh's at 46 positive and 25 negative, still by far the most popular leader. So not a lot of change in these final days. It hasn't been that, all of a sudden people woke up and said, I love one of these leaders. But Mr. Singh, remains the most popular leader and has done the best over this campaign.
All right. Let's talk about the question around who people would prefer to see as Prime Minister. What are they telling you?
So despite the Conservatives getting slightly more support in the generic ballot, we actually find that the Prime Minister, or the current Prime Minister, the Liberal leader, has a slight advantage on who people would prefer to be the Prime Minister after this election. 35, 32 for Mr. O'Toole and 22 for Mr. Singh. This is still, very close, and it's tightened over the course of this campaign. When it started, Mr. Trudeau had almost a 10-point lead over Mr. O'Toole. So again, even on this number, even on who people want after this election to be the Prime Minister, still very close.
Okay, lots of promises from the parties on the issues important to Canadians. How did the Canadians in your survey, and it's a survey of voters, how did they rank those issues?
So we asked people to rank the top 2 issues that are going to be most important to their vote. So there's lots of information on this screen, but the one issue that more people have gravitated towards is the cost of living. And so you got 36% saying that's one of their top 2 issues. Similarly, healthcare, dealing with climate change, making housing more affordable, growing the economy. These are issues that for the entire campaign, we've heard a lot from the parties and the candidates, and this is what Canadians have told us they want to hear. But what's interesting is there's one item that's actually changed over the course of the week, and that is those who say getting more people vaccinated and getting the country back to normal. Now, it's not the top issue, but it's increased by 3 points, and I think that's some indication that what's going on in Alberta and Saskatchewan and other parts of the country in terms of rising case numbers is getting more and more people, at least going into the polls today, thinking about the pandemic and maybe which party is going to be best able to handle that.
All right, a couple of areas to finish on here. We've also heard appeals from the party leaders, certainly in the last week of the campaign here, to the supporters of other parties to vote strategically. And so what effect has that had? What are you seeing?
Well, when we ask people, what will the possibility of a Conservative win do to your vote? Are you more likely to vote Liberal? Are you more likely to vote Conservative? Or are you just, does it not impact your view? And what you see actually is more people say, if I think the Conservatives can win, I'm probably going to be more likely to vote Conservative, including a third of New Democrats supporters, including 70% of those whose first or second choice is the Liberals or the NDP. And what's interesting on the other side is, and this is where we're going to be watching to see how did the People's Party do tonight, A lot of People Party supporters say, I'm actually not more likely to vote Conservative if I think they can win. Now, the screen up on your screen right now also is this sort of second part of this tension. So Conservatives might win, but we also ask people, what impact has the election being called in the first place had on your vote? And you can see more than half of Canadians say they are less likely to vote because Mr. Trudeau called this election when he didn't have to. In fact, 21% say they're not voting Liberal at all because of it. So that's the cloud that kind of hangs over this whole election, and we'll see tonight and whether either of these two factors plays into the choices people are making as they go in the polls today.
All right, David, let's finish on, as always, the upshot. What do you be watching for? What do you want to say as a final shot here, a final comment? You'll be on the desk with me tonight as well for the election results as they come in, but what's the upshot?
Well, Peter, I can't feel that this is a really close race. Obviously, the polls are suggesting it. I think we're going to be in for a late night. I'm excited to be with you. Ultimately, it just feels like this is an election that hasn't given any of the major parties much room to sort of go beyond where they were in 2019. So by all accounts, it's looking very close. And so, turnout's going to be a big factor, and seeing how effectively Elections Canada can move people through lines and whether people show up, I think will be a big factor that I'm going to be watching for tonight.